Thanks for taking the time to view our presentation on the ambiguity paradox. This presentation was originally given on January 29th, 2010 at a CISO legal update meeting that was sponsored by and held at Eckert Siemens' offices in Philadelphia. We shortened the presentation just a bit to make it a little bit more web friendly. When you look at the image on the left, do you see an old woman? Do you see a young woman? Perhaps both? Perhaps neither. Now, this is the type of ambiguity that has traditionally been the bane of those of us that practice information security. We've always come up with cute little phrases like good security equals good requirements. Because we haven't done, as an industry, as good a job as we would like to have, let's say, over the last few years, what we're finding is now is security is increasingly being defined for us by laws and regulations that are often not only overlapping, but progressively more ambiguous in terms of definition, deployment, and application. From a definition perspective, they've got phrases like quote unquote reasonable monitoring of systems for unauthorized use of or access to personal information. That means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Deployment. Let's say that you're a Massachusetts resident, you live in New Jersey, you're working for a New York-based firm, but you're working in the Philadelphia offices. Your data is in their human resources database. So who are you protected by? The laws of New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, all of them? And then when you look at application, almost all laws have the concept of applicability. That is, you can say that a particular control is or is not relevant in your environment. For example, a little less than half the requirements in HIPAA are referred to as addressable. So at some point, what we're finding and what we've come to realize over the last year or so is that we're going to hit a tipping point, and that tipping point is a point where more ambiguity actually creates greater clarity, and ambiguity becomes in itself inversely proportional. So the idea of this presentation is to get you to consider accepting, maybe even embracing ambiguity. One of the core places where this became available or became apparent to us was an organization that we do the security certification accreditation work for a PeopleSoft implementation that's got 400,000 employees' personally identifiable information in it. Over the course of a 3 or 4 year period, through multiple reviews of said system, increasingly we were not able to gather the information that we required from the local law support. Eventually, they bounced us upstream. We went uptown to the big offices with the deep carpeting, and that's where I learned that lawyers and economists are a lot alike. What I mean by that is that it's been said that if you take 10 economists that all won Nobel Prizes, you put them in a room and you ask them about the economy, you're going to get 10 different but equally valid opinions. It's exactly what we found here. The question was the new Massachusetts identity law something that we had to be concerned about? Because we did have some folks who worked for the organization that were from Massachusetts. After a lot of debating, what the end decision was from the lawyer was that dependent upon how that individual gained his job with this firm in New York City would define whether or not he was subject to New York laws or Massachusetts laws. Had the individual come to the company's website and applied for the job, he'd be covered by New York laws. But he would have the reasonable assumption he was covered by Massachusetts laws if they had actually advertised the job into Massachusetts. Needless to say, it didn't make it very easy to determine how to actually apply the standard within their environment. Some of the other complications that we saw there was that there were new laws. There's been 47 different PIIs passed by states, and new laws were issued before we'd gotten done remediating the last law. There's been new business requirements that created PII by combining different sources of data where there previously wasn't any. And then, of course, high trust changed things a bit as well. There was also some healthcare information in the system, and the definition again changed of what the treatment needed to be. If you take a look at the slide, you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. This is what we're all faced with, very wide variety of overlapping and competing standards. It's no wonder we're confused. But as you begin to peel them back, what you find is that virtually every one of those standards does one thing. It says you need to have certain controls in your environment. And at some point, depending upon how many requirements are thrust upon us, those number of controls are defined by what I'll call a control universe. That is that there's already a pre-existing universe of controls, a certain number of controls that's the maximum that you can have in your environment. And once you get to a certain point, it becomes easy. You just work to that control set. Now, your universe might be a little bit different. I've illustrated it with ISO 27002 here. You may use something like high trust if you're in the medical industry. You may choose to use the bit shared assessment program if you're in, let's say, the financial industry. But beyond a certain tipping point, what I like about this is that the inputs are no longer relevant. Really, it's all about outputs at that point. Some of the advantages to defining a universe, certainly it eliminates ambiguity. It also creates a positive situation in one of those areas that I think has been frustrating for most of us. As information security practitioners in the current best practice, really what we go to the business owners and we say, tell me what type of security treatment this data needs. One of the advantages of working with a universe is that you go to the owner of said data and you say, hey, here's how I'm going to treat your data. Tell me if you think any of that's a problem. The other thing it does is it simplifies execution. If you've got a well-vetted framework like ISO 27002 and 27001 that's been leveraged by thousands of organizations over 10 years, why do I need to recreate, the recipe? Recipe's been formulated for me. Let me follow it. The other advantage is that it evolves very slowly, even if the inputs evolve rapidly. ISO 27001, 27002 is an example, is premised off of British Security Standard 7799, which was introduced in the mid-90s. And it's changed very little over that course of time. And then, of course, you get to wear a real cool mask. I won't be able to go into this in the compressed time frame we have here, but real quickly, we got involved in two projects, the one on the left at a latter point, the one on the right at an earlier point. And the one on the left, we got involved after they defined about 1,000 controls for a e-commerce refresh, and they were having a challenge where the vendors didn't want to reply to the RFP. The one on the right we got involved in, and in the same type of a situation where we needed to trust a third party to manage our data in a way that was reasonable and appropriate. Instead of defining 1,000 controls, we defined 15 risks. Project has been a lot more successful. I'll let you look through that. Again, I won't be able to touch on this too deeply, but this is very interesting as well. One of our clients came to us and we were working with them on a 27001 pre-certification effort, and one of the first steps in the 27001 effort is conduct a risk assessment. And they said, well, we're going to conduct the risk assessment by doing a 27002 gap assessment. And of course, as an order, I said, that's not acceptable. That's not consistent with best practice. And he came forward and said, we feel that because of the size of our organization and the things we need to do, largely every control in 27002 is relevant to us, and risk is where our 27,000 controls are not applied properly. Again, he chose to define his universe. Although I didn't agree with this approach at the beginning, I did eventually agree with it, and it did pass muster during the ISO 27001 certification. So if you buy into what I've said to this point, I know it's been fast, what's going to happen over the course of the next year or two? First, and I think most critical for the ambiguity paradox to be realized, is IT GRC products need to really mature and gain greater market penetration. If the inputs no longer matter, and I don't think they do, the outputs matter even more. And what that means is that if we use this common control set, it's going to be very important that we're able to answer one set of questions and have those answers come out in reports or formats that allow us to show compliance with varying laws and regulations. I think another thing that you're going to see is increasingly people are going to be leveraging ISO 27001/27002 or other frameworks which are largely based on that, like I said, high trust and the bit shared assessment program. Over the course of the last couple of years, we've seen SIM evolve. I think we'll continue to see it evolve because it's the only way to measure improved compliance is to actually have large amounts of data that can be mapped back, much the same way we're talking about with GRC, map back to be able to prove compliance with these standards. I think the last thing you're going to see is that third-party security agreements are going to change quite extensively. And I think we're going to go away from a control-defined approach to a risk-defined approach. And I think really the most important thing is I think we are going to see security get better. I think this is a fundamentally sound approach, and I think as we leverage these frameworks to the extent that we can, we're all going to be better off for it. Thanks for taking the time to listen in on this. If we could ever be of any help, please don't hesitate to call on us.